they're in the Easter
discussion
service, so
that
could
follows.
possibly be that they're not in.
Our plan is to have a couple of presentations and then to have
You
a
talk
general
about
discussion
It is Jew.
around those presentations and
Not
your
exactly.
responses to the text. And
But you're right, it might not.
so I'd
be.
like to introduce Reverend James Lease, who
Is
comes
there
here,
a hold on, or there any Semitic
Is that-
reference on that or not?
comes here from Hanover.
Yeah.
I used to be over to
There may
cover,
be.
but good
Good
thank you.
friend of ours.
Yes, I used to be able to show up for the main study group fairly often, and then I got exiled by the bishop. Now, I mean, I was transferred by the bishop to Hanover, which actually has come with many blessings, certainly, but it has definitely also made it hard to show up for the main group here. So I'm very happy to be back today. Okay, I will try to give a Christian perspective from a Catholic angle, not necessarily, quote, the definitive Christian or Catholic perspective. And I don't really claim to represent anyone other than myself. But I hope to help to get a conversation going, and I hope that my remarks are illuminating. This is a study, as I said, there's the study group, but since being exiled to Hanover, I haven't really been able to participate in it. So the deficiencies in this talk are purely my own. And for full disclosure, the commentary that I use is one that's considered a classic on John's Gospel, Ray Brown, Gospel According to John. This is just the first volume. There's a second volume to it as well. I will discuss light imagery in my own liturgical tradition in other parts of Scripture, mention how this passage is used in my tradition, and give a few remarks on John chapter 1 and chapter 8 passages that we heard today. I should probably sit out my clock here so that I don't go too late over time here. And if my cell phone starts going crazy, you know there's white smoke and people are trying to get it. Okay.
You have to pick a name this afternoon, right?
Yeah, about 7 o'clock Rome time, 1 p.m. our time would be a good time for smoke to start coming out. So just so you know. Light in my own tradition, and this probably represents some Orthodox or Byzantine Christians as well. Liturgically, we love, I guess I should say I'm a Catholic priest, just so you know. Liturgically, we love light. We're light addicts. It's as if our liturgies were developed by people who suffered from seasonal affective distress disorder. You get a candle at baptism with an admonition to walk always as a child of the light. There was a rite called the Lucinarium in the ancient church, a lamplighting ceremony, which was really where we get our Vespers service in the evening. And if you've ever been to Byzantine Vespers, there's a series of lamplighting psalms. The Easter Vigil begins with a lamplighting. And we have a number of hymns, both in Vespers hymns and other times of the day, that very strongly depend on the theme of light. The Greek hymn, Joyful Light, goes back to like the 2nd century. One of our mainstays Sunday Vespers hymns is Lucis Creator, Supreme Creator of Light. And even one of the Lenten morning prayer hymns, Iam Christe Sol Justitiae, Christ, Son of Justice. So we have all sorts of light imagery going on. A couple background passages from Jewish scripture, which maybe Rabbi Chopra will deal with these as well, I don't know. We'll see, I hope I don't steal his thunder, thank you. First, though, in the Bible, thank you, excellent, thank you. First, though, in the Bible, I think we have to be clear, light does not always mean good, and dark always mean evil. For example, in 1 Kings, Solomon exclaims at the dedication of the temple, the Lord intends to dwell in a dark cloud. Indeed have I built you a princely house, the base for your enthronement forever. The light-darkness dualism, with which we're perhaps familiar, is really more at home in the Qumran Essenes, contemporaries of John, and apocalyptic literature of the 1st century. So what I'm trying to say here is that the good guys don't always wear white. Okay, moving on to some more familiar themes. The creation story. You all know it. And God said, let there be light. Exactly. Joseph Haydn's oratory of the creation treats this passage, and it's been called the brightest C major chord in history. Okay. In Exodus, as you know, there's the pillar of fire. We'll come back to that. Psalm 27, verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. a passage about which I spoke last year from Isaiah chapter 49. It is too little, he says, for you to be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will make you a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And from Zechariah chapter 14, verses 7 and 8, has a theme of both water and light going on in it, possibly germane to our conversation. That passage says, there will be one continuous day, it is known to the Lord, not day and night, for in the evening there will be light. On that day, fresh water will flow from Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea. This will be so in summer and in winter. And if you keep going in that passage, there's a mention of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths, or Sukkot, however you want to refer to it. So that seems germane to our discussion as well. Another theme, wisdom as light, in what we might call the Deuterocanonical books, in Wisdom chapter 7. It's a little lengthy passage here, but I'll read it to you. For wisdom is mobile beyond all motion, and she penetrates and pervades all things by reason of her purity. For she is a breath of the might of God, and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled can enter into her. For she is the reflection of eternal light, the spotless mirror of the power of God, the image of his goodness. Although she is one, she can do all things, and she renews everything while herself perduring. Passing into holy souls from age to age, she produces friends of God and prophets. For God loves nothing so much as the one who dwells with wisdom. For she is fairer than the sun and surpasses every constellation of stars. Compared to light, she is found more radiant. Though night supplants light, wickedness does not prevail over wisdom. We'll come back to that passage in a moment because it might sound familiar from John chapter 1, verse 5, where it talks about the light shines in the darkness and the darkness is not overcome it. So let me repeat that. Compared to light, wisdom is found more radiant. Though night supplants light, wickedness does not prevail over wisdom. So another passage here, also from the Wisdom of Solomon, light is God's revelation. It goes through a whole rereading of the plagues in Egypt and the Exodus narrative, and says this, instead of the plague of darkness, you furnish the flaming pillar, a guide on the unknown way, and the mild sun for an honorable migration. For they deserve to be deprived of light and imprisoned in darkness. They had kept your children confined. Through him the imperishable light of the law was to be given to the world. So that's Wisdom chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. Okay, that was a really quick reading of a number of things. I want to look at a couple passages from Christian scripture as well, what some might call the New Testament. Obviously from what we read today, I am the light of the world, John chapter 8, verse 12. Again, comes back in chapter 9, verse 6. And then Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, you are the light of the world, to the people listening to it. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. Incidentally, that was the title of Pope Benedict's 2010 interview, in which he says the Pope can retire. So it's on page 30, so I'm not sure why everyone was surprised. Just figured I'd slip that in here today. Another passage, Ephesians chapter 5. You were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For light produces every kind of goodness and righteousness and truth. Then in Acts chapter 26, verse 23, Paul preaches that the Messiah would proclaim light both to our people, to the Jewish people, and to the Gentiles. 1 Peter, quoting I think from Deuteronomy, says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, maybe it's Exodus, a holy nation, a people of his own, so that you may announce the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his own wonderful light. And the book of Revelation, otherwise known as the Apocalypse, closes the Christian canon with, the Lord God shall give them light, and they shall reign forever. So, light really pervades my tradition. You can find the theme other places in John's writings. So 1 John chapter 1, verse 5 says, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Light and darkness is not just a theme of revelation and wisdom, but also has an ethical dimension as well. 1 John chapter 2 says, whoever says he is in the light yet hates his brother is still in the darkness. Whoever loves his brother remains in the light, and there is nothing in him to cause a fall. Something else that I think it's important to remember in this passage is the John chapter 8 one especially, Jesus is at the Feast of Tabernacles, and there's a lot of tabernacles imagery goes on certainly in that passage and in other places in Christian scripture. And I have in my notes here, the significance of Sukkot, Tabernacles, Feast of Booths, might be lost on modern Christians, but not on the early ones. There's at least some use of tabernacles imagery in the New Testament, namely the Transfiguration, the shining cloud, and Peter's question about building booths recalls tabernacles. And in the book of Revelation, or Apocalypse, since all the kids at school are into like a zombie apocalypse, I like calling the book of Revelation by the name Apocalypse. So it gets more attention that way. Chapter 7, verse 9, talks about people holding palm branches. It talks about the glory of God giving light to the New Jerusalem. And as I said, the Christian canon really closes out with the eternal Feast of Tabernacles, a celebration of the presence of God among his people. And chapter 21 at the beginning says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, God's dwelling is with the human race. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will always be with them. So, light and tabernacles imagery certainly have a happy home in Christian liturgical and theological tradition. Now just a couple notes on the use of the passage in my own tradition, lectionary-wise. And this is really Roman Catholic to make it very specific, Roman Catholic post-Vatican II lectionary. Okay, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 8 is read at Christmas, the Christmas Mass during the day. And very fittingly, because I don't know if it's completely clear what the exact connection is, but I think it's hard to deny that our Christmas celebration has a little something to do with the solstice that falls around that time, and therefore the theme of light and darkness. And the use of this passage makes even more sense in the context of the whole Christmas cycle of readings. At the midnight Mass, so there's a midnight Mass, there's a Mass at dawn, and then there's a Mass during the day. It really developed out of the Pope went to St. Mary Major in Rome to have the celebration there. Then he had a service in the early morning for the imperial court, kind of down the road, and then went back to the cathedral to have the main kind of service there for the day. So the midnight Mass starts out with the reading from Isaiah, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Why might we read that? Well, because it's the darkest time of the darkest night of year, and the church is all lit up. The Mass at dawn starts with the entrance antiphon, which begins, Lux fulgere, light will shine forth. And the opening prayer has a number of light references. And then John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 is used at the Christmas Mass during the day. So the sun is up, it's light out, and you read the passage about the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's theologically exquisite, but unfortunately I think it's smushed over by many pastors nowadays who take the easy way out and use the midnight Mass readings for all the Christmas liturgies, choosing the cute Mary and Joseph story and sparing themselves from having to write one more homily. So you might think that this reading was chosen for the words, and the Word became flesh, and you'd be right, but think also it then is followed by what? And made his dwelling among us, or pitched his tabernacle or tent among us. So there's some tabernacles imagery even there. Okay, the collects and prefaces of Christmas certainly use a lot of light themes, and Epiphany, certainly rounding out the Christmas season, uses light themes as well. In the ancient church was actually called Holy Lights. So a lot of light imagery going on in Christmas. Okay, John chapter 8. We begin reading John's Gospel really on Monday of the 5th week of Lent. And then when we read John on weekdays from the 4th week of Lent, from the 4th week of Lent till Tuesday of Holy Week. We read this passage on Monday of the 5th week of Lent. We start reading John itself from the Monday of the 4th week of Lent till Tuesday of Holy Week. It deals with various controversies of Jesus, and it's kind of just to read it sequentially so that when we get to Holy Week, you'll kind of be caught up with the story. So the placement is significant, but the audience is usually fairly small. It's the daily Mass crowd. So not the whole parish Sunday Mass. It's usually, however many people show up for daily Mass. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 7 is one of the options for use at infant baptism. In John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41, yes, the whole chapter, yes, with the whole church standing to listen to the whole thing. We hear about it every time we do it. The fourth Sunday of Lent, cycle A, near its position that it had really from the 3rd century on Wednesday of the 3rd week of Lent. It was read for the great scrutiny for those preparing for baptism. In fact, some of you might have just heard it on Sunday. So it talks about Jesus' light of the world and the healing of the man born blind. So to say just a few words about the passages themselves. First off, light and darkness are all over in John. John chapter 3 says, "For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come towards the light, so that his works might not be exposed. But whoever lives the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be clearly seen as done in God." And then John chapter 11, Jesus says, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." And then let's see, we already read through John chapter 1, verses about 4 through 18. I just want to mention here about John chapter 1. Certainly there's a recalling of Genesis chapter 1, which also starts out in the beginning, just like John chapter 1 does. It's a very obvious parallel. Also has light imagery. The first work of creation is light, and so John here discusses light as well. One of the principal things that's going on in this passage is establishing a relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. Now, we're maybe not so conscious of it, but John the Baptist was immensely popular in his time. And at least the author of John's Gospel felt the need to clarify who really was, who was the center stage here. There's also certainly epic cosmic imagery and conflict. Light, darkness, whatever culture you come from, you can probably understand those themes pretty well. It came to home to me some time ago when I was somewhere where either the lights went out or I was on a camping trip or something, and it got to be dark, and then creepy crawly things started coming out, things with sharp teeth started growling and howling and so forth. And I realized that most of humanity don't live that way up until not that many years ago. So the image of light and darkness certainly would have been certainly is very powerful to us today. I think even more so in ancient times before like sodium lights and so forth to light up everything. Okay, John chapter 8 comes from a section of John that goes through various Jewish liturgical celebrations. Starting off with the wedding at Cana, moves through the Sabbath, through Passover, chapter 6, through Tabernacles, which is an immense section of John. It's chapters 7 through 10, and then the dedication of the temple, chapter 11. So the context of John chapter 8 is that it's certainly a very long section. And then chapter 9, the healing of the man born blind, is the object lesson of chapter 8. If you're light, you can make people see. And to say just a few words about tabernacles, just as was probably discussed last time about water, tabernacles had a water ceremony. It also had a light ceremony. There was a huge candelabra with oil in the court of women, and there was a lamp lighting on the first evening anyway, and it illuminated Jerusalem, possibly recalling the pillar of fire and the glory of God shining on the community in the desert. So the commentary I was reading, again, Ray Brown suggested that the themes that we've been looking at, bread of life, water of life, and light of life, are possibly ways of saying divine revelation. So that's one thought that I leave with you there. Okay, so in conclusion, there's a lot more that certainly could be said on the theme of light and on these passages, but I hope that this is sufficient to begin an enlightened discussion.
Thank you. So I'm gonna jump right in here, and some of the things that it connects. Yes, certainly. Light. I wanted to mention first of all Sukkot. Okay, there's this water libation festival was accompanied by a great amount of torchlight. There's a lot of light imagery, obviously, in Jewish tradition and light practice. We light candles on Shabbat and holidays, before Shabbat and holidays. There should be light in your home at these times. Light symbolizes God's presence. The eternal light in the synagogue is by the ark, over where the Torahs are, but it's also a reference to the light that burned eternally in the temple, and that leads, of course, to the story of Hanukkah, which was about, well, the oil story is about kindling that light, and Hanukkah is mentioned in John 10:22 as part of this connection of festivals, two festivals that you mentioned. So light symbolizes God's presence. Light symbolizes revelation. There's light at the giving of the Torah. There's torches at Sinai. The people see the thunder. And so thunder and lightning, it's literally the word see. There's rays of light on Moses' face during this time. And even before that, there's light at the burning bush, which means that light imagery and the Ea, which whenever we come across in the Greek scriptures this I am reference, I am what I am, I am, that connects to light as well. Light symbolizes righteousness and redemption. So Isaiah 2, house of Jacob, come let us walk by the light of the Lord. In Proverbs 2, to follow the ways of darkness means leaving the right path. Psalm 19 is half about the radiant light of the sun and half about Torah. About healing in Isaiah, then shall your light burst through like the dawn and your healing spring up quickly. And listen to me, in Isaiah 51, listen to me, my people, my nation, hearken to me, for Torah goes forth from me, my mishpatim, my statutes, for the light of the peoples. And of course, the light unto the nations passage, or light of nations. I will also make you a light of nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Now, that starts getting us into this issue of, which does come through John. So who does the light belong to? That's something that we're going to get. Which community, and how do we read that? But this light unto the nations, I will make of you a light of nations. All those references to a servant of God in Isaiah, there are ways, when we studied Isaiah last year, it was very clear that there are ways, which, and this is predominant in Jewish tradition, to interpret, it's not the only way, but it's often in Jewish tradition to interpret the servant as the people. And the servant in Christian readings could lead specifically to Jesus. So is the light unto the nations, is the nation the light, or is Jesus the light? And that gets to some of the things going on into John, because I think John is picking up on this servant imagery and the connection to light. Light also accompanies creation. So Psalms 104, God is described as wrapped in a robe of light and spreading the heavens like a tent cloth. And Genesis 1, of course, God said, let there be light, and there was light. So you put all of these together, divine presence, revelation, righteousness, redemption, creation. When we begin to read the book of John, and I focused a bit on the beginning of John, and some scholarship suggested by Daniel Boyarin that I read about in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, edited largely by Amy Jill Levine, who will be here in April. And Daniel Boyarin suggests looking at that prologue as a midrash. A midrash, a teaching that is drawn out of the text, connected to a text. So, if you look at Genesis 1 through 4. Here it says, when God began to create. In the beginning, when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And listen then, if you look at Proverbs 8, and this parallels some of what you were talking about with wisdom literature. Wisdom. Proverbs 8, I'm going to read verse 12 and then 22 to 36. I, wisdom, live with prudence, I attain knowledge and foresight. I, wisdom. So wisdom is speaking. Wisdom is speaking. The Lord created me at the beginning of his course. So, at the beginning, God created light. At the beginning, God created wisdom. As the first of his works of old, in the distant past I was fashioned. At the beginning, at the origin of earth, there was still no deep when I was brought forth. No springs rich in water. And if no deep, that's a reference also to Genesis. The Spirit of God hovers over the depths of no springs rich in water. Before the foundations of the mountains were sunk, before the hills I was born. He had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when he set the heavens into place, when he fixed the horizon upon the deep, when he made the heavens above firm, and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when God assigned the sea its limits, so that its waters never transgress God's command. When God fixed the foundations of the earth, I was with God as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before God at all times, rejoicing in God's inhabited world, finding delight with humankind. Now, sons, listen to me. Happy are they who keep my ways. Keep discipline and become wise. Do not spurn it. Happy is the one who listens to me, coming early to my gates each day, waiting outside my doors. For he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who misses me destroys himself. All who hate me love death. So, if you envision, in the beginning, God created, God said, let there be light. Light is that first act of creation. And now wisdom was here. Wisdom is doing all of this. Wisdom and light. Wisdom is light. Light is wisdom. And so then, if we look at John 1, in the beginning was the Word. Now, word, logos. Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Logos is the word that's used for God. Logos is what was used in the Alexandrian Jewish community, at least the Philo of Alexandria is any testimony to that. And it's thought that there may be a connection to the use of this word logos and the Aramaic word memra. Now, memra meaning word or utterance. It was a way, and it certainly is a way in Aramaic translations, Jewish translations, of trying to get away from anthropomorphic imaging of God. So God doesn't speak. God doesn't have a hand. God doesn't have an arm. God doesn't have a mouth. God doesn't speak. So it's the Word that speaks. The memra spoke. The memra, wisdom, light, logos, this all gets merged in some way. And so he was in the beginning with God. In the beginning was the Word. That's the light. That's the light that was created. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. This could fit into Proverbs 8 about wisdom. What has come into being in him was life. Wisdom is life in Proverbs. And the life was the light of all the people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And then skipping to about the connection that you were pointing out to John, but to keeping this focus on logos. Logos becomes flesh. According to Daniel Boyarin, that is where this midrash leaves being what would have been a kosher Jewish midrash up until it's when this light becomes flesh. All these other gospels, not all the other gospels, several of the other gospels begin with the genealogies, centering Jesus in a human context. This is a cosmological centering, connecting Jesus with the light of wisdom at the beginning. The thing about in John, though, I mean, what comes if you know, if Jesus is the light, some people have it, some people don't. Now, one thing I see happening, having basically tried to look at what light means in a Jewish context and then reading John, that's what I tried to do for preparing this. I did see, I saw a couple things happening here. One is the issue of bridging the immanent and the transcendent. Okay, so two midrashic statements of the problem from the Talmud. A reference from Hulin: just as you cannot look directly at the sun, all the more so can you not look at the presence of the Holy One itself. For no one can see me and live. So, I mean, light is wisdom, light is all these good things, but this light, this presence can be overwhelming. In fact, I read somewhere, if maybe I wrote that here, if there had been even a needle, if there had been even just the smallest crack in that cave where Elijah and Moses are hiding during Revelation. Elijah goes to the mountain at another time. And so if there had been even a hole the size of the eye of a needle, they wouldn't have been able to stand there. The light was so intense. Actually, here it is. Had there been a chink no bigger than the eye of a fine needle in the cave where Moses and Elijah stood together, neither of them would have been able to endure the light of the presence. As it is said, no one shall see me and live. In the name of Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So, in Jewish tradition, the same issue, bridging the immanent, how to deal with how to access or have a relationship with this light. How to have a relationship with this light when the light is so transcendent is what later Kabbalistic imagery is beginning to move into. It's an avenue of light that comes into the world and interacts with the world that you can interact with. So that the Ein Sof, the without end, God can remain unchanged. It's this flowing of light into the world that can be filtered in different ways that you can interact with. Similarly, this Christian story, it's an incarnational story, is a means of interacting on an intimate level with the overwhelmingly distant transcendent. And you could read that without that interaction, allowing for connection on a human level, the spirit is dead. So, John 1:14-18, and the Word became flesh. The Word is eternal, flesh is impermanent and decays, and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. Now, glory probably connects to Shekhinah, to presence, and the glory as of a father's son. I actually had imagery of a midrash of the son, midrash of a king and his son, from the Talmud, from Chagiga, with the light that God created on the first day, one could see from one end of the world to the other. But as soon as the Holy One observed the generation of the flood and the dispersion of humanity, God secreted the light away. For whom? For the righteous in the time to come. Just like a king who has a goodly treasure and sets it aside for his son. And where did God hide it? In the Garden of Eden. So, I'll come back to that. Hold on to that, I'll come back to that. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who was close to the Father's heart, who has made Him known. Meaning has enabled humans to interact with the transcendent. But the issue with John is that there's already that reference to no one may see me and live. So I see what I read in that book, the spiritual message being dealt with is how to interact with this transcendent when we are limited. But what about the antagonism? There is who owns the light? Because when you read a lot of these stories, Jesus is saying to the Jews, you don't get it, you don't have the light, I am the light, I am the way. And even at one point in 844, you are somehow connected to Satan, which has had terrible implications, a terrible history. And when what I have here is a note about postponed righteousness. I think it all comes down to where you seat yourself in the text. I can't help but reading these texts without positioning myself as the Jews who are being spoken to in this way. I don't know how Christians hear this text. Whether they are seeing themselves in the role of Jesus or in the camp of Jesus, though Jesus is very alone in these texts. Again, a lot of it comes, and then there's a lot of this apocalyptic imagery, light versus darkness. Children of light versus children of darkness. And the issue I see there, and the reason I brought this midrash, with the light that God created on the first day, one could see from one end of the world to the other, but as soon as the Holy One observed